Genesis 37:18 through 36. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of the robe, the ornamented robe that he wore, and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water into it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on the way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifted him up out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the ornamented robe taken to their father, and they said, "This is what we've found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol with my son, mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Friends, we're starting a new series this week that we're calling All in the Family. This is a season. We're filming this on Election Day, and we've got Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up. The holidays are such a wonderful time, but it also can be a contentious time. Sometimes we have anxiety about meeting with family members or being around extended family members that may not agree with us or that we have beef with. And sometimes when we feel that way, it can feel like we're the only person in the world that has family stuff. But reality is when you talk to almost anybody else, we've all got family stuff. And then when we take a wider lens at the biblical narrative, we've had family stuff as long as there's been families. So we're taking a look at several family drama moments in the Bible. And I'll be honest with you, friends, we didn't have to look very far. We had a lot of stories to pick from. There's a lot of strife and quarreling and stress when it comes to the family systems and dynamics in the biblical narrative. And we're doing this series not because misery loves company or you should feel less bad or more bad about your current situation. That's not it at all. But basically, we're doing this series to say family dynamics have always been kind of challenging, and God has been at work in them. And so how might we have the eyes to see how God is at work in our stuff? It doesn't make the stuff go away all the time. It doesn't always reconcile it, but how is God at work in the stuff? Our first glimpse is this story of Joseph. The Joseph narrative takes place in the book of Genesis, and it's a pretty important narrative in the Old Testament. It takes up many chapters of Genesis, and we kind of have zoomed in on a pretty particularly troubling part of this story where Joseph's brothers sell Joseph into slavery. Now, Joseph and his 11 brothers, they are the 12 sons of Jacob, also called Israel. These are the brothers that become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. So when we talk about families, this is sort of the emblematic, primary glimpse of the family that Israel based their whole identity on. And as such, there's a lot of weight put to this family. And we can see very clearly, this family didn't always get along, didn't always get it right. The brothers plot to kill their brother, as you heard. They plot to kill Joseph, and then there's a moment of redemption, a moment of sparing, a moment of grace where they just decide to sell him into slavery as if that were better. And we know that the narrative continues from this space, that Joseph goes on to be sold into slavery, and he ends up in Egypt, and he actually ends up in prison under the rule of Pharaoh. And by a lot of different circumstances and societal moments in Israel that were culturally contextual, Joseph interprets dreams for Pharaoh, and it's actually promoted, taken out of prison and promoted to the Grand Vizier. He's the second in charge of all of Egypt. Now that took many years to happen, but Joseph finds himself in a space of power. And what we notice about this story is that by and large, most of the stuff happened to Joseph. People were acting against Joseph, even though he wasn't necessarily making poor choices or doing anything wrong. In a lot of ways, he could be seen as the victim of this story. And, as time goes on, there's a real reality in which Joseph could have been very bitter about this circumstance. He could have let that hatred fester and rot and just only seek revenge and just be plotting the rest of his life about how he's going to get back at his evil brothers that did this vile thing to him. And as chances have it, we actually find a scene later in the book of Genesis where Joseph's brothers find themselves in front of Joseph. They're actually asking for food. A famine had come across the land. Joseph is the man in power. Joseph is the one deciding who gets the grain and who doesn't. Joseph's brothers show up in front of Joseph in a position of power, and you might think, in our human condition, we want revenge on Joseph's behalf. This is the opportunity. This is the moment to get them back for this horrible, horrific act that they did. But something different happens in the story. Joseph actually acts with compassion. He sees his brothers and he's moved with great emotion. And the question that we have to ask is, how do you go from this terrible thing happening to you to acting with grace and compassion? Well, a couple of things we want to note. This took many, many years. It took many, many years, and lots of circumstances changed, and lots of things happened to Joseph and to his brothers that led them up to this moment. But it's also very clear that Joseph didn't allow that poison of hate to infect his life and to sort of only think about retribution. Joseph was present in the moment of his own journey to see how God might be working in him and through him and for him to create circumstances in which his life takes the next right step. A lot of terrible things happened to Joseph. A lot of terrible things happened to Joseph. And yet he seems to be present to the movement of God's Spirit each and every time to see where God might take him next. And I think there's a really important lesson in this, because the reality of it is, friends, is that Joseph's story moves towards redemption. It is a slow redemption. It is a painful redemption. But when given the opportunity to choose retribution, Joseph actually takes the path of reconciliation. He is reconciled with his brothers over time and through lots of pain and certainly lots of tears. The hard truth is that we don't always get that moment. Maybe there's strife in your family. Maybe there's tension between siblings or tension between family members, and maybe that will reconcile, but friends, maybe it won't. I think the powerful part about the Joseph story is that even if we don't get that scene later in Genesis, even if we don't get this glimpse towards reconciliation and redemption, it seems as if Joseph was on his own journey with God, outside of how others might be acting on his behalf. Again, so much of the story was acting against Joseph. Joseph's agency is not really on full display, but what we do see is how Joseph is doing the work with God on his own. That even outside of the circumstances of his life, even outside of the way that other people treat him or act in his presence, Joseph has done the work to be right with God. And I think that's a challenge for us. So often we find ourselves in circumstances, whether they are in family systems or whether they are out in the world with people that we try to love and care about, that we have circumstances beyond our control. We can't control how people treat us or how people act towards us, but what we can control is how we respond. What is our inner sort of fortitude? What is our moral backbone in that space? How do we find that resilience even in the midst of circumstances that are not ideal? Joseph did the work. Joseph took the path of going back to God and saying, what do you have for me in this moment? It's not what I want. It's not what I would prefer. It would never be what I would pick. But God, how are we present here and now? And I think he does that every day for a long time, for a lifetime. And he builds up that resilience that we can see modeled in such a beautiful way at the end of Genesis. But that takes time and that takes effort. So friends, in the midst of all the stuff that might be floating around us, in the midst of all of the anxiety and the tension that we might exist in our families and in our systems and in our friends groups and all of the society at large, may we have the capacity May we have the courage to do the work, to ask, what do you have for me today, God? How can I show up to this moment in my life? And what is the next right step to make? Friends, may you have that courage this day and always. Amen.
Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above the fear? Can we learn to see the need? Can we share humanity? I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole as we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we ever rise above the hate? Can we learn another way? Forgive as you forgave. I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole as we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is making us, love remaking us. Come heal now, take away the blindness, so we can see what we were meant to see. We feel like devastating darkness. Oh, I can see another day come, and I can see another day come. Broken people, we can be made whole. Broken people, we can be made whole. Broken people, we can be made whole. We can be made whole. We can be made whole as we lay down our weapons, open up our hearts. Love is breaking us, love remaking us. Will we ever rise? Will we